Have you ever had that moment where your gut starts screaming at you, but your brain keeps saying, no, that can't be right? Where something feels off, but the person you're doubting is someone you're supposed to trust. Because that's exactly where I was in the morning. I decided to follow my daughter-in-law to work. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't plotting. I was just trying to understand why my late mother's house, the one I still paid taxes on, the one I still kept locked and untouched, suddenly felt like it wasn't mine anymore. And when I watched her pull out a key I never gave her, and unlock my mother's front door like she owned the place, that's when I realized this wasn't just disrespect. This was something else entirely. When my son first brought her home, I remember thinking how lucky he was, and how lucky I was too, because she seemed like the kind of woman every mother hopes her child will choose. Polite without being stiff, warm without trying too hard, the kind of smile that made you feel instantly at ease. She called me Mom almost right away, and I won't lie, that softened something in me that had been guarded for years. I had spent so much of my life giving, sacrificing, adjusting, that when someone new came along who appeared grateful and respectful, I didn't question it. I leaned into it. I wanted harmony. I wanted peace. I wanted my family to feel simple again. I treated her like a daughter, not like an in-law. I shared stories I hadn't told many people. I talked about my childhood, my marriage, the struggles my son and I went through when his father was working 2 jobs and barely home. I showed her old photo albums, laughed with her over memories, cried with her when my mother's health began to decline. When my mother passed, she was right there, holding my hand at the funeral, whispering that she was sorry, that she loved me, that she was there for me. In those moments, walls come down. You don't think about boundaries or paperwork or ownership. You think about connection. About comfort. About surviving loss with someone who seems to genuinely care. The house my mother left me wasn't just a building. It was the last physical piece of her that existed. In this world, every creak in the floor sounded familiar. Every window held a memory. I wasn't ready to touch anything inside it, let alone make decisions about its future. And I didn't hide that. I spoke openly about how hard it was for me to even unlock the door some days. My daughter-in-law listened, nodded, hugged me, told me to take my time, told me grief had no schedule. Hearing that from her made me trust her even more. I thought she understood. I thought she respected that space. I never imagined that my openness could be used against me. That my vulnerability could be mistaken for permission. I assumed certain lines were so obvious they didn't need to be drawn. I assumed love meant mutual respect. I assumed family meant you don't take what isn't offered, especially not something sacred. Looking back now, I realize how often women like me are taught that being accommodating is a virtue, that being trusting makes us good, that questioning someone's intentions is somehow unkind. So I didn't question her. I didn't monitor her. I didn't protect myself the way I probably should have, because I didn't believe I needed to. When she talked about wanting to work, to contribute, to build something of her own, I encouraged her. I praised her ambition. I told her I admired her drive. I never asked for details, because I didn't want to seem intrusive. I didn't want to be that mother-in-law. The suspicious one. The controlling one. I wanted her to feel supported, not supervised. And every time she smiled and thanked me, every time she hugged me goodbye in the mornings, it reinforced my belief that we were on the same side. Trust like that doesn't happen overnight. It's built through small, ordinary moments. Shared meals. Late-night conversations. Quiet understanding. That's why betrayal cuts so deep when it comes from someone you let into those spaces. It isn't just about what they did, it's about what you gave them access to. Your memories. Your grief. Your family history. I trusted her because she felt safe. Because she spoke gently. Because she never raised her voice. Because she played the role so well that I never thought to question the script. I didn't set conditions, because I didn't think love needed them. I didn't lock things down, because I believed respect would handle that on its own. I never once imagined that the same woman who cried with me in my mother's living room would one day treat that house like a tool, like a resource, like something to be used without my knowledge. That kind of trust doesn't break loudly. It fractures quietly, starting with denial, then confusion, then a deep, aching realization that kindness without boundaries can sometimes invite the very harm you never expected, and the hardest part isn't accepting what they did, it's accepting that the version of them you believed in may never have truly existed at all. It didn't start with anything dramatic or obvious, and that's what makes it so unsettling when I think back on it now. It started with little moments that didn't quite fit together, like puzzle pieces from different boxes. At first, I brushed them off, because that's what you do when you trust someone. You explain things away. You assume there's a reasonable answer you just don't have yet. When she mentioned her new job, I smiled and told her how proud I was, but almost immediately, the details began to blur. One day she talked about traffic near the river, how the sun reflected off the water during her drive. Another day she complained about a crowded mall area, about parking garages and escalators. I remember nodding along, even though those places were nowhere near each other. I told myself maybe she had to travel between locations, maybe the job had multiple sites, maybe I was overthinking it. Then there was her schedule. She'd leave at roughly the same time every morning, but some days she'd return unusually early, other days far later than she claimed she should. When I casually asked how her day went, her answers were vague. Busy. Same as always. You know how work is. The warmth in her voice felt rehearsed, like she was sticking to safe phrases that couldn't trip her up. Again, I ignored the small knot forming in my stomach. I didn't want to interrogate her. I didn't want to seem suspicious. So I smiled, listened, and kept my thoughts to myself. Her exhaustion didn't match her stories either. She'd sigh heavily, drop her bag on the table, and talk about how draining her day had been, yet she never mentioned co-workers, never complained about a boss, never shared the kind of everyday annoyances people usually do when they come home from work. It was all abstract, like she was describing the idea of being tired rather than the reality of it. I remember thinking how strange it was that someone so social, so talkative, suddenly had nothing specific to say about such a big part of her life. The first real jolt came with the mail. I still remember the feel of that envelope in my hand, how ordinary it looked until I saw her name printed clearly above my mother's address. I stood there longer than I should have, reading it again and again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less alarming. My heart told me this wasn't right, but my mind rushed in to soften the blow. Maybe it was a clerical error. Maybe she'd filled out a form wrong. Maybe it meant nothing at all. I placed the letter on the counter and didn't say a word. After that, my awareness sharpened. I started noticing things I hadn't before. How she sometimes talked about having space to focus. How she mentioned liking quiet neighborhoods. How she asked oddly specific questions about the house my mother left me. Did I still have the utilities connected? Was the internet ever turned on? Had I thought about renovating? At the time, I thought she was just being helpful, maybe even encouraging me to move forward with my grief. Now, I realize those questions were pieces of a plan already in motion. Then a neighbor made an offhand comment that landed like a weight on my chest. She mentioned seeing lights on at my mother's house late one evening, and said she thought maybe I'd started spending time there again. I laughed it off, told her no, that the house was still locked up. But as I walked back to my car, my hands were shaking. Lights don't turn on by themselves. Someone had been there. Someone with access. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind replayed conversations, expressions, small inconsistencies I'd dismissed too quickly. Her casual confidence when she talked about her days. The way she never seemed worried about job security or finances, despite supposedly starting something new. The ease with which she deflected questions. None of it screamed wrongdoing, but together, it formed a picture that made my chest feel tight. I started checking things I'd never thought to check before. Utility usage. Property records. Little details that confirmed my growing suspicion without fully explaining it. I felt torn between two truths, one where I was being paranoid and unfair, and another where I was being quietly deceived by someone I had trusted deeply. It's a lonely place to be, that space between doubt and certainty, where you're afraid to look closer, but even more afraid of what it would mean if you didn't, and every unanswered question sits with you, heavy and unresolved, whispering that something important has already shifted and will never feel the same again. Deciding to follow her wasn't something I did lightly, and it certainly wasn't something I felt good about at the moment. I wrestled with that choice longer than I care to admit, pacing my living room late at night, replaying conversations in my head, arguing with myself the way only someone full of doubt can. Part of me kept saying that I was crossing a line, that trust once broken in your own mind is hard to repair, even if you turn out to be wrong. Another part of me whispered that ignoring my instincts had already cost me peace, that the questions I was avoiding were growing heavier with each passing day. I told myself that if I followed her and discovered nothing, I would feel foolish but relieved. I could apologize silently, forgive myself for the suspicion, and move on. But if I didn't follow her and something truly was wrong, I would never forgive myself for choosing comfort over truth. That was the thought that tipped the scales. Not anger. Not jealousy. Fear of regret. Fear of staying silent and later realizing that my silence had allowed something sacred to be taken from me. The morning I made the decision, everything felt slightly unreal. She moved through the house like any other day, sipping her coffee, checking her phone, talking about errands she needed to run after work. I nodded, smiled, and answered her as I always did, while inside my heart was racing. When she grabbed her bag and said goodbye, hugging me quickly before heading out the door, I stood there longer than necessary, listening to her footsteps fade. For a moment, I almost let it go. I almost convinced myself to sit back down and forget the whole thing. Instead, I grabbed my keys. I waited a few minutes so it wouldn't look obvious, then pulled out of the driveway and followed her at a distance that felt both too close and too far. My hands were tight on the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on her car, my thoughts spiraling between hope and dread. I kept expecting her to turn toward the main road, to head somewhere familiar, somewhere that would prove me wrong and ease the knot in my chest. Each time she passed an intersection without turning, my stomach sank a little more. As the streets changed, so did my breathing. Familiar landmarks slipped by, replaced by quieter roads, older houses, and a sense of dread I couldn't shake. My mother's neighborhood crept into view before I was ready for it, and in that moment, I wanted to turn around. I wanted to pretend I hadn't seen the street sign, hadn't recognized the curve in the road, and hadn't felt my heart drop into my shoes. But I kept driving, because once you see something like that, you can't unsee it. She slowed down and pulled into a spot directly in front of the house. My mother's house. I parked across the street, my car engine still running, afraid that if I turned it off, I might not be able to move again. Time seemed to stretch, every second loud and sharp. I watched her step out of the car, adjust her bag on her shoulder, and glance around casually, like someone arriving at a place that belonged to them. That was the moment something inside me cracked. When she reached into her purse, my breath caught. I knew what was coming before it happened, but I still wasn't prepared for the sight of that key in her hand. She didn't hesitate. She didn't fumble. She unlocked the door with a confidence that spoke of routine, of familiarity, of access she should never have had. The sound of the lock turning echoed in my head long after the door opened. I sat there frozen, overwhelmed by a mix of disbelief, anger, and a strange sense of validation. I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't exaggerated the signs. My instincts hadn't betrayed me. And yet, the confirmation hurt far more than the uncertainty ever did. Watching someone cross a boundary you never gave them permission to approach is a different kind of pain, one that settles deep and heavy in your chest. Stepping out of the car felt like stepping into a different version of my life, one where the rules I thought we all followed no longer applied. Every step toward that house felt weighted with memory, with grief, with the realization that I was about to confront a truth I could never put back once it was spoken aloud, and even before I knocked on that door, I knew that whatever happened next would permanently change how I saw her, how I saw my son, and how I understood my own strength, because sometimes the hardest decision isn't to confront someone else, it's to finally trust yourself enough to look directly at what you've been avoiding all along. The moment that door swung open, it felt like the air had been knocked out of me, not all at once, but slowly, painfully, the way it happens when something precious is being taken from you in front of your eyes and you're powerless to stop it. From the sidewalk, I could already see that the inside wasn't the way I had left it. The familiar shadows were gone. The dim, untouched stillness I'd preserved out of love had been replaced with something bright and altered, and something that didn't belong to the memories that lived there. I took a step closer, then another, and with each step my heart sank further. The living room was almost unrecognizable. The couch where my mother used to sit with her legs tucked beneath her, watching old game shows, was gone. In its place sat a sleek, modern sofa in a color she would have hated. The coffee table my father built with his own hands, sanding and shaping it in the garage when money was tight, but pride was strong, had vanished. The walls had been repainted in neutral tones, stripping away the warmth my mother loved. Even the curtains were different, replaced by something minimalist and cold. It felt less like a home and more like a stage set, like someone had stepped into my grief and rearranged it to suit their convenience. When she opened the door and saw me standing there, the look on her face told me everything before she said a single word. Her eyes widened, her smile vanished, and for just a second, the mask slipped. I saw panic. Not surprise, not confusion, but the kind of fear that comes from being caught mid-act. She tried to recover quickly, asking what I was doing there, her voice too high, too rushed, like she was scrambling to get ahead of the truth. I didn't answer right away. I just looked at her, then past her, taking in the full scope of what she'd done. I asked her, calmly, why she had a key to this house. Not accusatory, not loud, just steady. She hesitated, then laughed nervously, saying she was just helping, just keeping an eye on things for me. I asked her why her mail was being delivered here. Another pause. Another excuse. Something about paperwork, about convenience, about it not meaning anything. I asked her why the utilities were active, why the furniture was gone, why this place looked lived in. Her answers started to overlap, contradictions piling up on top of each other, and that's when the truth began to leak out in fragments. She admitted she hadn't been going to work. Not the job she told me about, at least. She said she needed a quiet space, somewhere separate, somewhere she could focus. She said my son had given her the key, said he told her it would be fine, that I wouldn't mind. Hearing that hurt more than I expected, not because I believed she was telling the whole truth, but because it confirmed how casually my trust had been handled. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a decision. A series of them, made without me, about something that was never theirs to decide. As she talked, I felt something strange happen inside me. The anger I thought would explode never really did. Instead, a cold clarity settled in. I realized that yelling wouldn't give me back what had been taken. Tears wouldn't restore respect. And begging for understanding from someone who had already crossed this line would only give her more power. So I listened. I nodded. I let her explain herself into a corner, watched her words tangle as she tried to justify the unjustifiable. I told her I needed some air and stepped back outside, my legs shaking beneath me. Standing on that porch, I remembered my mother sitting there in the evenings, waving at neighbors, humming softly to herself. I remembered promising myself I'd protect this place until I was ready to let it go. And in that moment, I understood that protecting it didn't mean keeping it frozen in time. It meant reclaiming it. Taking it back from someone who saw it as an opportunity instead of a legacy. When I left, I didn't slam the door. I didn't threaten her. I simply told her we would talk later, that this wasn't finished. And as I walked back to my car, I knew something fundamental had shifted. The house had been changed, yes, but so had I. The innocence I'd carried into this situation was gone, replaced by resolve. I no longer needed to wonder if I was overreacting or imagining things. The evidence was right there, stripped bare, impossible to deny, and as painful as it was to see my mother's home altered without my consent, the deeper wound was realizing how easily someone I trusted had convinced herself that my grief was a doorway she was entitled to walk through without knocking. What surprised me most after everything came crashing down wasn't how angry I felt, but how quiet I became. There was a stillness inside me that hadn't been there before, a kind of clarity that only shows up when you've finally seen the truth without filters or excuses. I didn't rush to confront everyone involved. I didn't call relatives to vent, or friends to validate my feelings. I knew that if I reacted emotionally, I would lose control of the situation, and control was the one thing I needed back more than anything else. So instead of raising my voice, I started gathering facts. I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and wrote down everything I knew: dates, conversations, inconsistencies, proof. I pulled property documents and verified ownership, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted everything airtight. I contacted a lawyer quietly, explained the situation without dramatics, and listened carefully as my options were laid out in clear, unemotional terms. For the first time since my mother passed, I felt like I was actively protecting something again, not just mourning it. The locks were changed first, legally and professionally, not out of spite, but out of necessity. When the locksmith handed me the new keys, I felt a sense of relief wash over me that I hadn't expected. It wasn't about keeping someone out, it was about re-establishing boundaries that should never have been crossed in the first place. I shut off the utilities temporarily, not to punish, but to make it impossible for the house to continue being used without my consent. Every step I took was calm, deliberate, and documented. When the cease and desist letter was delivered, I didn't wait around to see the reaction. I already knew it would cause disruption, and that was the point. Actions taken quietly have a way of speaking very loudly when the truth finally surfaces. Her business unraveled faster than I thought it would, not because I attacked it directly, but because it had been built on something that didn't belong to her. Clients asked questions she couldn't answer. Orders stalled. Stories didn't line up. And suddenly, the confidence she carried so easily began to crack. My son came to me angry, defensive, accusing me of being cold and unforgiving. I let him speak. I didn't interrupt him. When he was done, I laid out everything in front of him: the mail, the records, the timeline, the proof. I didn't embellish. I didn't accuse. I just showed him the reality of what had happened. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavy but necessary. He didn't apologize right away. He didn't even say much. But I could see the shift in his eyes, the moment when denial gives way to understanding. I didn't demand that he choose sides. I didn't ask him to punish anyone on my behalf. I let the truth do what it always does when it's allowed to stand on its own. Over time, other family members learned what had happened, not through gossip or emotional speeches, but through straightforward explanation. People stopped defending what couldn't be defended. Trust, once lost, didn't magically return, and that wasn't something I tried to fix for anyone else. The most important part of the revenge wasn't watching her lose access to what she'd taken. It was reclaiming myself. I went back into my mother's house slowly, room by room, undoing what had been changed. I brought back the furniture that mattered. I rehung the curtains my mother loved. I sat on that old couch and let myself cry, without feeling like I was intruding on my own memories. The house didn't just feel like it belonged to me again, it felt protected. There's a misconception that revenge has to be loud to be satisfying, that it has to leave visible scars to be effective. What I learned is that the strongest kind of revenge is rooted in self-respect. It's choosing not to beg for what's already yours. It's refusing to explain your boundaries to people who benefit from pretending not to understand them. It's standing firm without becoming bitter, decisive without becoming cruel. I didn't destroy her life. I didn't need to. She did that herself the moment she decided my grief was something she could step over instead of honoring. All I did was step back into my power, draw a line that should have been there all along, and let consequences unfold naturally. And in doing so, I found something I hadn't realized I'd lost, a deep sense of confidence in my own instincts, a reminder that kindness doesn't require self-sacrifice, and that sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is a quiet one that says, "This is mine, this is enough, and I will not allow it to be taken from me again."